So this is explaining what is the actual science going on here. What are the problems with the claims that they make, which are as varied as they are levels of incorrect. They have this huge problem with real science. They don't like it. We talked about this before with the consensus earlier in the program. We talked about it with the models, which are unfortunately an inferior method of doing science. In this case, it's all they have. There's no option to do a better version because we can't make an experiment with a duplicate Earth to use as a control and test various factors. There's so much going on. It's so complex. I'm glad we're trying. I do want science to continue to find out what these mechanisms are, find out how we can model them. The problem is these models, they're not ready. They're not even close to ready. And we're trying to not just draw conclusions about them, but govern economic policy about them, govern social policy about them. It's not ready, not even close. And we've been going over the numbers. We were just talking about CO2, whether or not it's actually a problem, how much we're actually producing of it. And, well, it's not a problem. We're not producing that much, and it doesn't even cause global warming. It follows global warming. That's what the data says. You can look at it throughout huge, long periods of history, and it's very clear. It doesn't happen 100% of the time, but the vast majority of the time, the rises in CO2 come after the warming, not before. If they were driving it, they'd come before. But yeah, it's not happening. Sorry I get so worked up about this. It's just so frustrating to see people who should know better. These levels of data, they're not locked away in a sealed room that they only allow the quote-unquote climate experts to access. This is information that is widely available, but it gets twisted, so nobody looks at it. It gets twisted because, well, quite honestly, it's pretty dry. It's not fun to read journal articles. They can, it's one of those things where you can read the same paragraph 12 times over again, and you still have no idea what you just read in some cases. It can very much be that way, and they take advantage of that. They say, oh, well, I looked it all over, and it's all good. We're causing global warming. We need to adopt the Green New Deal, or we're all going to be dead in 12 years. Well, hang on. Let's back up a sec. That's kind of an extreme prediction, especially considering all of your others have been wrong. So, real quick to go over some of the other arguments, aside from the CO2 one, they talk about, well, what about Antarctica? The ice caps are melting. Basically, no, they're not. The northern Arctic ice cap, they keep predicting that we're going to lose it, that we're going to have summers without a northern ice cap at all, without an Arctic ice cap, and then it just doesn't happen. The polar bears, well, turns out the polar bears were just dying off because people were hunting them. They stopped. They put a ban on hunting polar bears, and now the polar bear population is exploding. They may even become a pest. We may get to a point where now we have too many polar bears. Either way, it didn't have anything to do with global warming. It had to do with hunting. The same thing goes, well, not the same thing, but in a similar sense, what they've been reporting on for the Arctic is saying that it's going to melt and go away. It's, in some cases, had more ice than previous years. In some cases, it's just kind of remaining stable. Well, one of the things about Antarctica is it's been growing in ice. This is something I mentioned at the beginning of the program, that I got kicked out of a class, a geology class, because I was asking the professor about this, and he was talking about the Arctic, predicting that it was going to be iceless soon, talking about Greenland, about how Greenland has been losing ice, and that we've been able to track the recession of these glaciers, and how much of a problem it is for the Earth. And so I raised my hand, and I said, well, is this really a problem? I mean, how much of the Earth's ice is covered in Greenland? By the way, it's 4%. And he said, it's a huge landmass. He was just dodging around. He didn't know what the answer was. And I had just read a paper on this. I'm not faulting him for not knowing the answer off the top of his head. Not everybody has that information. I was just lucky because I had just come out. So I raised my hand again and said, I thought I read it's only 4%. So what about the other 90% or more of the world's ice? What's going on with that? Well, the Antarctic is melting as well. Raised my hand again. I thought the Antarctic ice sheet was growing. Isn't that what the most recent papers have said? He got tired of it. He swore at me in words I cannot use here on the radio and kicked me out of the class for the day. He didn't like my questioning, and I was polite. I was calm. He didn't want to accept this at all. And Antarctica is growing. There was even a documentary, I think called Blue Ice or something, trying to show that Antarctica is going down. Well, so this actually came out when I was doing some of my geology studies at UC Davis. And they even had a special screening of this documentary showing what dastardly humans are doing to the Antarctic ice sheet. Well, it turns out that the Antarctic ice sheet was growing, and it had a high from about 2012 to 2014. In 2015, it went down to its average level. Oh no, the Antarctic ice sheet is decreasing? It's only going down to average? This is a catastrophe. We have to have a documentary about this and talk about how humans are causing it. It was completely bogus. The Antarctic ice sheet has been growing. There was another study they tracked it from 92 to 2008. It grew an average of 200 billion tons of ice per year on the east side and 65 billion tons of ice on the west side. That's a lot of ice growing. If 90% of the Earth's ice is growing, who cares about the rest of it? I mean, if we're looking at it as a whole, the Antarctica during this time period, it was reducing sea levels by about 0.23 millimeters per year. Lowering sea levels, not raising them, lowering them. So when all these people are saying, well, the sea levels are going to rise an inch or a foot or 20 feet in 100 years, like Al Gore tried to claim in his movie that no science supports this claim. Well, what about Antarctica? What if the sea levels actually reduce? They have no answer for this because they don't even acknowledge that Antarctica is growing. They'll show videos of, look at this ice falling off of this ice sheet. Look at it melting like that. Well, isn't it curious that that's the only way ice ever falls off of itself through melting? Any other ice that you ever see, it doesn't melt that way. Anybody that's lived in a snowy climate, when the ice starts melting, it just shrinks and it reduces. Some of it evaporates, some of it turns into water and melts and runs away, but it doesn't just break off a chunk and fall down. That's actually called calving. C-A-L-V-I-N-G, calving, and that is what happens when ice expands. That's what happens when the glacier gets too big and it can't support its weight, and the end tip of it falls off and slides into the ocean. It's because it had too much ice. It got bigger, not melted, didn't get smaller. It's a complete misrepresentation of this, and it's bad science, and it's completely politically driven. So what about cows and methane? This is something that has been going around for decades, trying to claim that, well, eating beef is contributing to the cow population, and the cow population, whether the cows fart, they produce methane, and that contributes to global warming. There's been another study done recently that exposed a huge problem with this. It was done by Glatzel, G-L-A-T-Z-L-E, in 2018, and it showed that the title of it is Domestic Livestock and its Alleged Role in Climate Change, and it talks about how the warming potential for anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions has been exaggerated. They have an abstract. They even have key points about this, so you don't even have to read the entire journal article, because for any of you that do read journal articles, my heart goes out to you. They can be very dry and boring. Luckily, this one has a nice set of bullet point summaries. And they basically, the previous models, again, this is model-driven data. Anyone who knows anything about programming knows this motto of bad info in, bad info out. That's what you get with the models. Your model is only as good as you were able to produce the proper framework. There was a correction that needed to happen in these models, and it said omitting this correction leads to a systematic overestimation of farm-borne non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. That's basically methane. Several methodology deficiency propagated through the scientific literature. The point 3, they say, between 1990 and 2005, the world cattle population rose by more than 100 million head, according to FAO statistics. During this time, atmospheric methane concentration stabilized completely. How do you add 100 million cattle and get no change if cows are the driver of methane in the environment, methane in the atmosphere? It's all because of the wrong models. The models predicted a certain level, and they just went with that. It's so bogus. It's completely unscientific, and it's really pernicious. That's the real problem here, is because they make it look legitimate, and they're just using these methods to try to make crazy claims and get people to jump through hoops to fix it. There's a leading scientist, Richard Lindzen. I talked about him before in the program. He's the head climatologist at MIT, professor emeritus there. He was the world's authority on climate change, and he's a man-made climate change skeptic. He was talking about extreme weather examples, because that's another thing that they always claim. Oh, well, we're going to see more tornadoes and more hurricanes and more floods and more extreme weather. This is evidence that global warming is happening. When, of course, the increase in this is just because of increased publicity, because we have more news. We have a 24-hour news cycle that is constantly reporting on any of these disasters, so that it looks like they're more frequent. Here's what he has to say about global warming and extreme weather.
What about extreme weather? I'll just do that briefly. But this is one of the crazier things. Extreme weather is pure propaganda. The IPCC itself acknowledges no relation. That's important to understand. They have said that. I keep insisting, when you're attacking the IPCC, it's all well and good, but check what's inside it. What's inside it is often something that would argue against the hysteria. And given that it's in the IPCC, you can use it to your advantage. In the extratropics, outside the tropics, what forces weather disturbances and variance is the difference in temperature between the equator and pole. All models of warming say that goes down, not up, in a warmer world, which would suggest you have less potential for storms and less variance. It doesn't matter that that's the case. It's not scary, so you say the opposite.
He hit the nail on the head. This is their tactics, that you have to scare people to get them to do anything. So it doesn't matter whether or not the information is accurate. Scaring them is what is important. This is something where this is a point that actually overlaps with my philosophy degree. I have a degree in geology and philosophy, if you missed the first part of the program where I talked about that. And in philosophy, there have been many studies showing this, that moral philosophers do not behave more morally than anybody else. Now, you'd think if these are supposed experts on morality, they understand the nuts and bolts of how it works, why it's important, that sort of thing, wouldn't they behave more morally? Turns out they don't. The reason for this is simple. More information doesn't change your motivation. Emotions change your motivation. That's what causes behavior. And that's what's going on with so many of these scientists. Emotionally, they have this belief in climate change. That's why it fits more like a religion. And more information about what is actually going on, more information about CO2 being a result of warming and not a driver of warming, doesn't impact them. More information about cows not actually causing increased methane levels doesn't faze them. More information about Antarctica growing, probably not least of which is because the ozone hole is closing, the other catastrophe that they were crying about for so long. They ignore all of this information because it doesn't fit with their beliefs. It doesn't fit with their emotions about this topic. And it's incredibly problematic. The hallmark of good science is if we can understand, explain, and predict. Being able to do those things is the goal of really all science. So we've tried to understand it. Quite frankly, we don't. There's too many variables at stake here. We're doing a better and better job. We should still keep trying. I'm not saying give up the fight at all. But we shouldn't claim that we have accomplished this already. We shouldn't just decide, oh yeah, yep, we understand it all. We're done. No further inquiry needed. Then the next step is to explain it. Well, they're doing a very poor job of that because they don't care about explaining it. They just have their own conclusion that they want to talk about.